Solo Leveling by Chu Gong. Chapter 3 Part 1 The Final Test. The divination circle inscribed on the floor in the middle of the temple rose to a height of about 2 stairs and then ground to a halt. An altar, Jin Wu was muttering to himself, but the other hunters were listening intently. Altar? He definitely just said altar. The one who'd saved their lives twice earlier wasn't some high-rank, spiritually awakened being but Jin Wu, an E-rank hunter whom they usually looked down on. If it wasn't for Sung, we would be. Everyone felt the same way. Jin Wu's words were their sole lifeline. Without realizing this, Jin Wu had let slip the word altar. Kim caught on quickly. I see. He unsheathed a sword from his waist. It was originally made for dealing with magic beasts, but was now absolutely essential for a completely different reason. I may not be the smartest, but even I get what's going on here. Others shifted uneasily when they saw the sharp blade of the weapon in Kim's grip. Hey, Kim! Why'd you draw your weapon? Let's talk it out, okay? Now that the highest-ranked member of the party, the C-rank Song, was wounded, there was nobody who could rein in Kim, who was regarded as fairly strong among the D-rank hunters. He pointed at the altar with his sword. The last commandment is thou shalt prove thy faith, and an altar appeared in the middle of the room. He looked at Jin Wu. Doesn't this mean we have to sacrifice someone, Sung? Jin Wu nodded. He'd had the same thought. One of the 6 survivors was to become an offering. That's probably what the last commandment means. That was the conclusion Jin Wu had reached. Sensing someone approaching, he looked up and noticed an unnerving look in Kim's eyes as the older man neared him. A bead of sweat slid down Jin Wu's face. Mr. Kim. What? Shut up and stay still. Kim yelled, pointing his sword at Song, who had crouched beside Jin Wu to inspect his injuries. Who dragged us in here? It was Song, right? Then shouldn't he take responsibility for this damn raid and see it through to the end? Mr. Kim! Enraged, Jin Wu tried to stand, but he was stopped by Song's calloused hand. He looked at Song. Song wordlessly shook his head. His eyes were pleading with Jin Wu to keep quiet. Jin Wu had a lot he wanted to say, but he forced himself to swallow his words. Song heaved himself to his feet. Kim is right. I need to take care of this. Looks like we're talking the same language now, old man. Kim gestured at the altar with the tip of his sword. If you understand, let's get this over with. More than 10 people are already dead because of you. Kim's close friend, Park, had also lost his life. With his mind clouded by grief and rage, Kim had effectively forgotten that they'd all taken a vote before entering the double dungeon. Song spoke to Kim. I'll do this myself, so could you sheath your weapon? Kim immediately refused. Why should I trust you? Stop talking and keep walking. Song sighed and started walking toward the altar. Kim followed him, keeping his weapon leveled at Song's back. Jin Wu bit his lower lip as he watched them. This isn't Mr. Song's fault. It had been a course of action agreed on by everyone. Song didn't deserve the blame just because things had gone south. But Jin Wu didn't have the strength to stop Kim. Kim was one of the strongest D-rankers, and Jin Wu was the weakest among E-rankers. The difference in their power levels was clear. To make things worse, Jin Wu was also now missing a leg. If he went against Kim, he'd endanger himself as well as Juhi, who was still committed to treating him. Damn it! Jin Wu squeezed his eyes shut. He'd never resented his own lack of power more than now. Song had already reached the altar. Whoosh! A single red flame flared up on its side. Everyone watched nervously for what would come next. However, nothing happened. The appearance of the flame was all that occurred. When nothing more transpired, no matter how long they waited, Kim, who'd forced Song onto the altar, and the others were bewildered. Kim looked back at Jin-woo.
Hey, Sung, were we wrong?
Jin-woo shook his head.
I'm not sure either.
They thought the third commandment would be fulfilled if they sacrificed someone on the altar. Maybe it's not about offering a sacrifice. This wasn't exactly bad news for them. If this wasn't about a sacrifice, that meant Song didn't have to die. Jinwoo's face brightened. He tried to stand while sweating profusely from the effort, so 2 hunters rushed to help him up.
I'd like to take a look at the altar, so could you help me get up there? Jin-woo, your wound is still.
Juhi stood with him. She was deathly pale from using too much of her magic. Thanks to her efforts, she'd managed to keep his bleeding and pain to a minimum. I need to hurry. Between Juhi's condition, Kim's temper, Song's injury, and the other hunter's fear, Jin-woo was running out of time. He reached the altar with the help of the 2 hunters.
Let's get on.
The 2 hunters hesitated momentarily, but they put their faith in Jin-woo and helped him up onto the altar. As they did, 3 more flames came to life. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Jinwoo's eyes flashed. The number of flames and the number of people are the same. Song, Jin-woo, and 2 supporting him. 4 flames for 4 people. The flames encircled the circumference of the altar. Judging by the distance between these fires, the circle just needs 2 more. It was looking like their remaining companions would have to join them on the altar in order for anything to happen. Jin-woo asked Song.
Will other hunters come to rescue us if we wait here?
Song shook his head.
It's been a week since the gate first opened. Those things will act before any rescuers can get here. I guess the association ignored the gate for too long, since it's D rank. You know how it is with the association.
A gate would completely open after 7 days. The main purpose of raids was to defeat the boss of the dungeon in order to close the gate before a week was up. Failure to do so meant the magic beasts imprisoned within could freely exit to the outside world. Jin-woo looked behind him. The giant was still sitting on the throne, looking down at them with arrogant eyes. If that thing gets out, the damage it would cause was unimaginable. Of course, if that happened, the people in this chamber would be the first slaughtered by either the Colossus or the smaller statues. The only certainty was that they couldn't afford to wait while doing nothing. Jin-woo called for Juhi and Kim.
I need you both to come up as well.
Juhi climbed onto the altar first. Kim reluctantly followed suit. 2 more flames lit up, and the circle was complete. Whoosh! The hunters jumped in surprise.
Huh? What's going on?
Something was happening, just as Jin-woo had predicted. It's starting. Tiny blue flames ignited along the very edge of the altar, forming a circle. There were easily more than 30 of them, tightly arranged. 34, 35, 36. Jin-woo quickly counted a total of 36 small blue fires. 6 red flames matched the number of people, but 36 blue flames. What do they mean? Just then, thud. Without warning, the doors suddenly swung open. The hunters reflexively twitched.
HNGH!
Every part of them screamed to run toward the exit, but having witnessed what had happened to the young hunter from the choir, they couldn't bring themselves to take even 1 step forward. There was no telling how they might be killed by trying to take the initiative. Everyone looked at Jin-woo for a solution. However, he pressed his lips into a line. He didn't have any answers right now. He couldn't tell whether the open doors were a trap or if the 3rd commandment had been fulfilled and they could get out of here. While everyone's eyes were fixed on Jin-woo, a jarring noise resounded throughout the room. Creak-keek, creak-keek. The hunters urgently scanned the area.
What now? They're closing in. Those bastards just moved.
Their breathing quickened. The party had thought the stone statues moved only when someone approached, but they were now several steps closer. In an instant, Jinwoo assessed the situation. No, it's not the stone statues. It's the platforms under them that were moving. The harsh sound that had hurt their ears was most likely from the platform scratching the floor as they advanced.
Did they stop?
Kim wiped the sweat from his forehead. While everyone was distracted by the statues, Jinwoo looked down to inspect the blue flames. They were extinguishing one by one. 3 were already gone. Creak. Someone yelled.
WH what? Where's that coming from?
Jinwoo glanced up. The noise had come from the direction he was facing. He realized the statues in front of him seemed to be a little closer than the others. Why is it only the ones in front of me? Was it because he'd stopped paying attention to them? Jinwoo closed his eyes to confirm. As soon as he did, the noise came again. Creak. The noise stopped when he opened his eyes. The figures had definitely gotten closer.
What the fuck? WH, what do we have to do?
Jinwoo yelled.
Don't take your eyes off the statues.
Come to think of it, the sentries had first started moving when everyone had turned to him. Those things approach when we're not looking at them. Jinwoo spotted another blue flame going out. Nothing had happened to his group, though. Neither were there any changes in the stone statues. Maybe. Jinwoo started counting carefully in his head while he kept an eye on the statues. Like I thought, one of the little fires went out every minute. The blue flames are a timer. The way to fulfill the third commandment was to endure on the altar until all 36 blue flames went out. This meant they were safe as long as they kept an eye on the stone statues. It was very likely they would all survive this final round. Jinwoo looked down to inspect how many of the blue flames remained in order to calculate how long they had to last. There are 30 left. They just had to last 30 minutes. But that was Jinwoo's fatal mistake. The statues near Jinwoo had approached the altar while he was counting the flames. Creak.
HNNGH. AR.
The hunter standing with his back to Jinwoo shrieked and bolted toward the doors. The constant grating noise coming from behind him had spooked him. A red flame went out as soon as he jumped off the altar.
No!
Jinwoo cried. Defying all expectations, though, the hunter who had run away screaming his head off safely passed through the open doors.
Huh? What just happened, son? He got out!
Jinwoo was faced away from the doors, so he hadn't been able to observe what had happened.
Did anything change? The doors closed a little. Are they still closing? No. They closed a fraction when that guy left the altar, and then they stopped.
Jinwoo remembered that one of the red flames had gone out when the hunter left the altar.
Shit!
His heart sank. He'd finally figured out the answer to the question that had been bothering him the whole time he'd been standing on the altar. How was this a way to prove their faith? He had his answer. It was the absolute worst test for Jinwoo, since he needed someone else's help just to stay upright due to his leg injury. The open doors were actually a trap. It was false hope they could actually see. If everyone on the altar had run to the open doors all at once, the red flames would have been extinguished, and the doors would have immediately slammed shut. All that would have remained was a festival of blood and screams. On the other hand, the altar was the promised land. It was an area that guaranteed everyone's safety as long as they stayed in their respective places and did their respective jobs. It was a choice between visible hope and an invisible promise. The third commandment, to
prove thy faith,
was a test to see if they could resist sweet temptations while under the pressure of impending doom. In their case, there were two variables. The first was Jinwoo himself. People who would have ordinarily run toward the open doors instead had stopped to listen to what he had to say. Because of this, they had thankfully avoided the disaster of the doors closing completely. We got lucky. There was no other way to put it. It had been possible only because he'd earned people's trust by figuring out the meaning of the first two commandments by himself. The second variable had arisen rather unexpectedly. Someone had left the altar. How would people react now that they could see that hope was within their grasp? It was obvious. The man who'd been supporting Jinwoo flung him aside to run out of the room. Song rushed to steady Jinwoo with a hand on his back. Whoosh! When the man stepped down from the altar, another red flame went out, and the doors closed even more. Creak!
Hey, hey!
Kim yelled after the second escapee, but he'd also managed to flee from the room unscathed. Jinwoo counted the red flames and shouted,
Nobody move! We can't lose any more people.
Front, back, left, and right. They needed at least 4 people in order to monitor all sides. Jinwoo, Juhee, Song, and Kim remained. If they lost a single person, there would inevitably be a blind spot. Kim wiped his forehead again.
Sung, what's going on? Explain it to us. We just have to stay here like this until all the blue flames go out.
Jinwoo shared everything he had figured out so far. Kim nodded and listened intently. After his quick explanation, Jinwoo added one more statement at the end.
We can get out of here alive.
Each commandment indicated a way to survive the room. The last couldn't be any different.
All we have to do is stay where we are.
Jinwoo was absolutely sure they could survive without any more injuries if they trusted one another. Kim, however, had a different perspective. He asked hesitantly,
Sung, you may be right, but the doors might also completely shut when the time is up, right?
Jinwoo couldn't answer. He'd come to this conclusion after considering all the options, but he couldn't give them any guarantees until everything played out. But Kim needed certitude. Ensuring his own survival was more urgent than the mere possibility of everyone making it through.
Sorry, but I can't do this. Mr. Kim. Sorry.
Kim slipped down from the altar. He ignored Jinwoo's calls and sprinted toward the doors. He took one last look at the others once he reached the exit, but he didn't return. Rendi. Jinwoo gritted his teeth.
Damn it!
Despite saving their lives, what had been returned to Jinwoo wasn't kindness or gratitude. All that was left was betrayal. As he calculated, it was a problem keeping an eye on the statues without Kim. It had been impossible from the start for 2 heavily injured people, and someone frightened out of her wits to monitor the entire area. The statues they couldn't keep in their field of vision started moving. Creak-keek. Creak-keek. The sentinels were tightening their ring around them. Song, who'd been surveying the situation, told Jinwoo and Juhee,
You too should leave.
He sounded like he had given up.
Mr. Song, like Kim said, I was the one who brought you all here. If someone has to stay, it should be me. What? You have a few more days to live than I do anyway, so you should go.
Song chuckled. This was Song's small kindness to help them feel better for having to leave without him. Jinwoo helplessly nodded. Although he felt awful, there was no time to argue about who would remain. Song intended to ask Juhee to help Jinwoo walk.
Juhee, could you help Sung? Yes, of course.
However, when Juhee made to stand, she collapsed to the ground.
Ah.
She tried her hardest to get up, but soon tears welled in her eyes.
I can't move my legs.
Jinwoo's and Song's faces grew grim. It was easy to see that Juhee wasn't in good shape. Her lips were blue, and her body kept convulsing minutely. This was the after effect of using too much of her magic when she was already mentally and physically exhausted. It's because she tried to fix my leg. Jinwoo was rendered speechless by how sorry he felt. But there was no time for this. Creak. The statues were drawing ever closer toward the altar. Jinwoo shook off Song's hand and flopped down on the floor. Song's eyes widened.
You?
Jinwoo spoke with determination.
Please take Juhi and get out of here, Mr. Song. I told you that I'd stay. Then who's going to help Juhi?
Jinwoo couldn't even stand on his own, much less get Juhi to the door before time was up. Of course, they could abandon her here. But Juhi had saved Jinwoo's life multiple times over the years, and even her current awful state was because she tried to treat him with everything she had. He didn't want to abandon someone like her, survive, and carry the guilt for the rest of his life.
There's no time. Please go.
With a stern expression, Song pulled Juhi up. Juhi shook her head as tears streamed down her face.
No. Jinwoo can leave instead. I can. Remember I promised to take you to dinner?
Jinwoo took out the Urank essence stone from his pocket and pushed it into Juhi's hands.
You go get dinner ahead of me. I'll collect my change from you if I make it out of here.
She frowned at him when he smiled at her.
How can you joke at a time like this?
He nodded at Song, who in turn lightly struck Juhi on the back of her neck. Thwack! Juhi fainted. Song hoisted her prone body onto his shoulder.
I'm sorry. It was my call anyway.
Song bowed to Jinwoo. With this last gesture of farewell, he quickly leaped off the altar. Creak, creak. While they were talking, the stone statues had come within striking distance. Jinwoo knelt and took a deep breath.
You.
He noticed the sword that Kim had abandoned next to him. He stretched out his hand and grabbed it. If I'm going down, I'm taking at least one of them with me. He looked back in time to see Song escaping safely with Juhi. That was a relief. Glad I'm the only one dying. He didn't consider it some great sacrifice. It was what he thought would be the best choice, all things considered. He'd have had to live the rest of his life without a leg. Not only would it have been impossible to continue working as a hunter, but he wasn't even sure he could live a normal life. He was a high school graduate with no special skills, so making ends meet wouldn't be easy. My mother's hospital bills and my sister's tuition. He figured it'd be better for his family to claim the life insurance. Was it 300 million won or 400 million won in insurance money for the family of a hunter who dies in a raid organized by the association? The money was more than enough compensation for the life of a worthless E-rank hunter. Creak, creak, thud. The bastards had finally arrived. The first stone statue to reach the altar took its initial step up. Jinwoo leveled the sword at it as he watched.
Come at me!
But the attack came from behind him. Shook. A long spear pierced through Jinwoo's body from behind.
Gak!
He coughed out blood. Pain shot through his entire body.
Just a little higher, and the beast would have punctured your heart.
Juhi's scolding from a few hours earlier echoed in his mind.
Aard!
His assailant raised the spear until it was vertically positioned. Jinwoo hung in the air, impaled on the tip. He briefly struggled from the pain, but before long, the statue threw him to the ground. Crash!
Ugh!
He could hear bones breaking everywhere in his body. The pain caused him to curl into a fetal position.
Ah! Ah!
The stone statues gathered around the trembling Jinwoo. They completely surrounded him. He shuddered as he looked up at them. I don't want to die like this. As the fact that he was about to die finally sank in, tears pricked his eyes. He recalled the faces of his family. He thought of Juhi and Song, the ones who had been concerned for him until the very end. I don't want to die. This was not the way he wanted to end his short life of 24 years. Stomp. A stone-faced statue with a sword stepped closer to him. It raised the weapon high. Despite the violent tremors racking his body, Jin-Woo defiantly held its gaze. At last, the sword came straight down. Shuck. If I could get one more, just one more chance. Jin-Woo refused to close his eyes. That was when. Skreek! The sword suddenly stopped on its way down, as if someone had hit the pause button on a video. No, it hadn't stopped. It was moving so slowly that it looked like it had. It was descending at a rate of maybe 1 millimeter per minute. The blow was slow, but it was definitely still coming down. What? Jin-Woo couldn't hide his confusion. Just then, ping! An electronic chime and a woman's voice he'd never heard before echoed inside his head. You have fulfilled all the requirements to complete Secret Quest. Courage of the Week. Secret Quest? Fulfilled all the requirements. Jin-Woo had no idea what was going on. And where is this voice coming from? The commentary plowed on despite Jin-Woo's confusion. You have acquired the qualifications to be a player. Will you accept? Acquired? He had to accept something? Sounds like they're giving me something. Having grown up in a poor family, Jin-Woo had never refused when offered something for free. But that was when he was alive. Once he died, what use would free things be to him? As Jin-Woo hesitated, the voice in his head repeated itself, as if it was feeling urgent. Your time is running out. Your heart will stop in 0.02 of a second if you choose not to accept. Will you accept? Jin-Woo wasn't sure if the voice was a hallucination of some kind, but he knew for a fact that he was close to death. Not only was there a sword aimed at his head, but countless other weapons were now also targeting him. If he was attacked by all those, would there be anything left of his body? He didn't care what happened at this point. If you're giving it to me, I might as well. He didn't even have to say it aloud. All he did was think it, but the voice in his head responded right away. Congratulations on becoming a player. Flash. A bright light engulfed Jinwoo's body as he lost consciousness.